The night was cold, the air thick with an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang over the quiet London street. Inside the dimly lit apartment, Dennis Nilsen sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the lifeless form of Stephen Dean Holmes, a 14-year-old boy who had unknowingly sealed his fate with a simple decision to accept a stranger's offer of drinks. The room was filled with the faint smell of alcohol and the lingering traces of fear that had permeated the space just hours earlier. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Dennis knew what he had done, what he had planned to do all along. In that moment, the line between life and death blurred, the ordinary became horrific, and a killer was born in the shadows of a London flat. On November 23, 1945, in the bustling fishing town of Fraserburgh, Scotland, Dennis Nilsen was born. He was the second child of Elizabeth Duthie White and Olav Magnus Moxheim. Olav, originally from Norway, had arrived in Scotland 5 years earlier as part of the Norwegian Free Forces following the German occupation. Once settled in Scotland, he adopted the surname Nilsen. Dennis had an older brother, Olav Jr., and later a younger sister named Sylvia joined the family. However, the marriage between Elizabeth and Olav was far from harmonious. Olav was primarily focused on his military duties and showed little interest in family matters. After several attempts to find stability in their marriage, the couple divorced in 1948. Left to care for her 3 young children, Elizabeth received support from her parents who had never approved of her relationship with Olav. They were happy to take on the role of devoted grandparents, particularly doting on Dennis, who was described as a quiet but adventurous child. During this time, Dennis enjoyed long walks with his grandfather, who carried him on his shoulders through the countryside, along the harbor, across the wide stretch of beach, and up to the sand dunes. Dennis cherished these moments with his grandfather, his hero and protector. On October 31, 1951, tragedy struck when Dennis's grandfather died of a heart attack while fishing in the North Sea. At the funeral, as Dennis gazed at his grandfather in the open casket, his grieving mother told him that his hero had gone to a better place. This memory stayed with Denis for the rest of his life, and he became increasingly withdrawn. He began spending more time alone, often watching the herring boats from a distance. He also resented the attention his mother, grandmother, and later his stepfather showed towards Olav Jr. and Sylvia. As Dennis entered his teenage years, he found the local routine increasingly suffocating. At 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force, where he excelled academically, particularly in history and art. After graduating in 1961, he briefly worked in a canning factory while considering his career options. It was during this time that he realized his true calling. He enlisted in the Army with the intention of becoming a chef. Dennis thrived in the catering corps and found great satisfaction in his work. However, it was also during this time that his true sexual orientation began to surface, though he kept it hidden from his colleagues. For example, he avoided showering with other soldiers to prevent any suspicion of the physical attraction he felt towards them. In mid-1964, Dennis was officially assigned to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers in Osnabrück, Germany. To cope with his shyness, he turned to alcohol, and around this time, certain intimate fantasies involving another man, often unconscious, began to emerge. After a brief stint as a cook for the British Army in Norway, he was posted to Aden, now part of Yemen, in 1967. The environment was far from ideal, as he was assigned to work as a cook in a prison, a more dangerous post than his previous ones. His regiment lost several men, often ambushed on their way to the barracks. Denis himself was once attacked by a taxi driver, who then locked him in the trunk of his car. Denis managed to free himself, overpowered the man, and beat him until he was unconscious. After 11 years of military service, Denis attained the rank of corporal, but he decided to leave the army and return to his family home in October 1972. He needed a few weeks to contemplate his future, but his mother was more concerned about his lack of female companionship and didn't hesitate to let him know. This pressure, combined with a heated argument in which Olaf Jr. accused him of being homosexual in front of the family, prompted Denis to leave. He never spoke to his brother again and only maintained sporadic written contact with the rest of his family. Denis moved to London and joined the Metropolitan Police. The city, with its diverse population and vibrant life, seemed like the perfect place for him to be who he wanted to be. Armed with a video recorder, Denis captured much of what he experienced. While he enjoyed the work, he missed the camaraderie of the army. His nights were often spent alone, with alcohol as his only companion. In the summer of 1973, he began frequenting gay bars, which led to intimate encounters with other men. However, the casual nature of these encounters left him feeling empty as he sought a meaningful and lasting relationship. Although he eventually entered a relationship, it was shorter than he had hoped. When the relationship ended, Denis concluded that his personal lifestyle conflicted with his job. Determined to find a job that better aligned with his plans, he resigned from the police force in December. After a brief period working as a security guard, he found stable employment as a civil servant in May 1974. Quiet and conscientious in his work, Denis also became actively involved in the trade union movement. 18 months later, Denis met a 20-year-old man named David Gallican. Their relationship quickly intensified, and before long, they moved in together to a ground-floor apartment, which had the added advantage of exclusive use of the backyard. They made some renovations, and at first, Denis felt comfortable in the relationship. However, tensions soon began to rise between them. They started sleeping in separate beds, and eventually, both began bringing casual sexual partners home. Although their arguments never escalated to physical violence, the growing strain between them eroded their bond until they eventually decided to part ways. Returning to the solitude he had known since childhood, Denis's work attendance began to suffer. In contrast, he often volunteered for extra shifts, leading his colleagues to suspect he was a loner, and they were right. Over the next several months, Denis tried to connect with various young men, but none of these attempts led to lasting relationships. What made it worse was that, during his search for an ideal partner, he found no one willing to live with him. By the end of 1978, Denis had convinced himself that he was not fit to live with anyone. His nights were spent painfully alone, with only records and alcohol for company. On December 29th, Denis started drinking early in the day. By nightfall, he decided he could no longer stay within the confines of those four walls. With New Year's Eve approaching, he longed for companionship. It was then that his path crossed with that of a teenager named Stephen Holmes. Stephen, a 14-year-old from Ireland, was on his way home that night after attending a rock concert. When they encountered each other on the street, Dennis noticed that Stephen had failed in his attempt to buy alcohol. Offering him drinks and a good time at his place seemed like the perfect excuse. They drank heavily before eventually falling asleep. The next morning, Dennis woke up to find Stephen still asleep beside him in bed. Afraid that Stephen would wake up and leave, Dennis gently caressed him for a long time, ensuring he stayed asleep. In his mind, Dennis decided that Stephen would stay with him through the new year, whether he wanted to or not. Using a necktie, Dennis tightened it around Stephen's neck until the boy could no longer breathe. Once Stephen was unconscious, Dennis submerged him in a bathtub full of water. Later, he buried the boy's body beneath the floorboards of his home. This marked the beginning of a dark path for Denise, who now possessed a new kind of housemate. For the next 7 months, Dennis occasionally used Stephen's lifeless body as company until he finally decided to burn it in a bonfire. On December 3, 1979, Dennis met Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian student touring the UK, at a bar. Under the pretense of showing him around the city, Dennis convinced Kenneth to come back to his apartment for food and drinks. But once there, as Kenneth listened to a record, Dennis ended his life. This time, he used the headphone cord as the lethal weapon. The next day, Dennis purchased a Polaroid instant camera and photographed Kenneth's body in suggestive positions. He then placed the corpse on his bed and spent several hours watching television with it. Finally, Dennis wrapped the body in plastic bags and stored it beneath the floorboards. Although Kenneth was reported missing and the case received significant media coverage, no one discovered what had happened to him. In the months that followed, Dennis would occasionally unearth Kenneth's body, sit it in a chair next to him, and watch TV while drinking. In early May 1980, Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old catering student from Birkenhead, decided to hitchhike to London without his parents' consent. On May 13th, he was questioned by the British Transport Police for not paying his train fare. From then on, Martin spent 4 nights sleeping outdoors near Euston Station. On May 17th, Denny encountered him while returning from a union conference. Exhausted and hungry, Martin happily accepted Dennis's offer of food and a place to stay for the night. Once Martin fell asleep in Denise's bed, Denise tightly gripped his neck. He then submerged the boy's head in the kitchen sink. With the lifeless body in the bath, Dennis marveled at Martin's youth and freshness. 2 days later, he buried the body beneath the floorboards. From that moment on, Denise was consumed by an almost uncontrollable urge, leading him to claim 5 more victims in the following months. However, only one of them was identified: William Sutherland, a 26-year-old from Edinburgh. As the bodies piled up beneath the floorboards, insects were attracted, and a foul odor began to permeate the apartment, especially during the summer months. Dennis tried to mask the stench with deodorants and regularly sprayed insecticide, but the smell of decomposition persisted, as did the presence of flies and other pests. Even the unbearable conditions did not deter Dennis from his gruesome practices. Malcolm Stanley Barlow, born in Sheffield and orphaned at a young age, was a 23-year-old epileptic who had spent most of his life in care homes. On September 18, 1980, he visited Dennis's home to thank him for the medical assistance he had provided the day before. Tragically, Stanley never left that house. Dennis took his life and, with no more space available under the floorboards, stored Stanley's body in a closet. By the end of the year, Denny had accumulated so many bodies that he was forced to take drastic measures. He exhumed and dismembered the remains of each victim and burned them in a bonfire he built on a vacant lot behind his apartment. To mask the smell of burning flesh, he topped the fire with an old tire. The following year, Denis moved to a new residence. This time, it was an attic apartment which meant he couldn't hide bodies beneath the floorboards, nor did he have the convenience of a garden. Despite these less-than-ideal conditions, Dennis continued his deadly practices. In March 1982, Dennis crossed paths with John Howlett, a 23-year-old man. After convincing John to come back to his place, Dennis took his life and then dismembered him. To dispose of the body, Dennis flushed pieces of flesh and internal organs down the toilet. As for the larger bones, he simply left them out with the trash. One night in May, Denny met Carl Stoddard, a 21-year-old man, in a bar. Carl was feeling depressed over a failed relationship, which Denny quickly picked up on during their conversation. After offering Carl some alcohol, Dennis invited him back to his apartment. Once there, Carl soon fell asleep on an open sleeping bag. This time, Dennis acted differently. He only strangled Carl enough to render him unconscious. Over the next 2 days, Carl drifted in and out of consciousness. When Carl finally regained enough strength to ask Denise what had happened, Denise gave a vague explanation and later escorted him to a nearby train station. Carl had no idea that he was the only one to survive among the many who had crossed paths with the macabre host. In his professional life, Denny showed no signs of being anything other than an ordinary man. His ability to appear perfectly normal even earned him a promotion to executive director, and in June 1982, he was transferred to another workplace in northwest London. 3 months later, Dennis encountered Archibald Graham Allen, a 27-year-old father, as he was trying to hail a taxi. Dennis offered him a meal at his home, which Archibald accepted, unaware of the horrors awaiting him. As Archibald enjoyed his meal, Dennis struck, as he had done many times before. He kept Archibald's body in the bathtub for 3 days before reducing it to small pieces. Stephen Neil Sinclair, a 20-year-old heroin addict who also had a habit of self-harm, was Dennis's next victim. On January 26, 1983, Dennis met Stephen on the street, bought him a hamburger, and invited him back to his apartment. Stephen consumed alcohol and injected himself before Dennis ended his life. Dennis placed Stephen's head, upper torso, and arms in a chest of drawers in the living room, while the lower torso and legs were stored beneath the bathtub. On February 3, 1983, the residents of Dennis's building experienced severe plumbing issues as all the toilets were clogged. This wasn't the first time such a problem had occurred. Previous blockages had already baffled a local plumber. Determined to find a permanent solution, the residents called in a man named Mike, a plumber from a private company 5 days later. When Mike arrived at the building, he was immediately struck by the overpowering stench. In his entire career, he had never encountered anything quite like it. Given the situation, the first thing Mike did was inspect the septic tank adjacent to the building. Shining his flashlight, he was met with a disturbing sight. There was a layer of a whitish, viscous liquid speckled with what appeared to be blood. As he descended into the pit, he discovered decomposing pieces of flesh. The scene was chilling. Mike immediately reported his findings to his supervisor, and the two returned to the property the next morning. When they arrived, the drains had been cleared, except for some pieces of flesh and 4 bones in a pipe connected to the upper floor of the residence, Dennis's apartment. The police were notified right away. The police were brought up to speed on the situation. The discovered bones were taken to a morgue, where a pathologist confirmed they were human. The police waited for Dennis to return from work. When he arrived, the detectives explained that they needed information about the blockage in the drains of his unit. Initially, Dennis wanted to know why they were interested. At that point, the police informed him that the blockage had been caused by human remains. They cut Dennis off, urging him not to waste time and telling them that they knew there was a body and just needed to be shown where it was located. Dennis led the detectives to his apartment, where they were immediately hit by the stench of decomposing flesh. Calmly, Dennis admitted that what they were looking for was in 2 plastic bags in his closet. Although the detectives chose not to open the bags at that moment, Dennis confessed that it was a long story, one he was finally ready to tell, but only at the station. The detectives then proceeded to arrest him. On the way, when asked if the remains belonged to 1 or 2 people, Denise looked out of the patrol car window and after some thought stated that there were 15 or 16. That night, the police went to Dennis's residence. They retrieved the bags from the closet and took them to the morgue. On February 11, 1983, an extraordinary interrogation began, lasting 11 days. Dennis dictated more than 30 hours of detailed confession, describing the various crimes. He attempted to help the police as much as possible by providing details and descriptions of the men he had targeted to aid investigators in identifying them. While Dennis's recollections of some unidentified victims were vague, he was able to vividly remember how each had died and how long their bodies had been kept before being dissected. Dennis was officially charged with the murder of Stephen and transferred to prison, where he was held in custody until his trial. At that time, he claimed his mood was one of resignation and relief, believing that he would be treated according to the law and considered innocent until proven guilty. Later, forensic officers descended upon the backyard of Dennis's former residence, using sieves to search for teeth and bone fragments that Dennis had buried or discarded. Meanwhile, Dennis began sending letters from prison to the police. In these letters, Dennis exhibited a visible grandiosity, which was seen as part of an undeniable narcissistic profile. For instance, he stated that he had no tears for himself or for those affected by his actions. On May 26, 1983, Dennis was put on trial at the Old Bailey on 5 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Initially, Dennis intended to plead guilty to each charge. Simultaneously, he opposed using a prison report and threatened to protest, but his stance only led to his confinement in his cell. On August 1st, Dennis threw the contents of his chamber pot outside his cell and assaulted several prison officers. The incident resulted in a conviction on August 9th for assaulting prison officers, for which he was sentenced to 56 days in solitary confinement. 5 weeks before his trial, Dennis dismissed his defense attorney and opted to be represented by another lawyer. Following his advice, Dennis agreed to plead not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. The trial commenced on October 24, 1983, with an additional charge of murder and 2 more of attempted murder. When Denny pleaded not guilty due to diminished responsibility, the prosecution had to debate whether his actions were cold and calculated, or whether he suffered from a mental illness that prevented him from being held accountable for his crimes. A doctor called by the defense testified that Dennis's personality disorder was so overwhelming that he was essentially a man drowning in his own nightmares. On the prosecution side, a doctor was the expert witness. While he acknowledged that strangling people was not normal behavior, he stated that during his interviews with Dennis, he found no evidence of a severe personality disorder. In his opinion, Dennis was fully aware of what he was doing. On the first day of his trial, Dennis looked exactly as he always had, an elegantly dressed subordinate official, a suburban resident, and a dog owner. He was described as the kind of man you might see in a bus queue or at the post office, someone you'd barely notice and certainly wouldn't feel uneasy around. He blended into the background, a faceless man in the crowd, wearing large metal-framed glasses, a sports jacket, trousers, and a tie. The latter accessory took on more sinister connotations later when it was revealed to be his preferred weapon of murder. On the second day of the trial, the survivor took the stand. As he recounted what happened in May 1982 when Dennis tried to strangle and drown him, Carl's voice frequently trembled with emotion. Several times the judge had to give him time to regain his composure. As the trial progressed, Dennis listened attentively but without emotion, as the prosecution, along with witnesses and experts, presented the enormity of his crimes to the jury. He remained unmoved, almost as if these horrific acts had been committed by someone else. The prosecution recounted the circumstances of Denis' arrest and the subsequent calm and practical confessions he offered. The court also heard several voluntary statements made by Denis, many of which painted a picture quite different from the one the defense wanted to portray. After the final arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the jury retired to deliberate their verdict on November 3, 1983. The following day, they returned with a unanimous guilty verdict on 6 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. The judge sentenced Dennis Nilsen to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Once behind bars, Dennis was classified as a Category A prisoner and was given his own cell, where he could mix freely with other inmates. He did not appeal, accepting that the prosecution's case was essentially correct. In September 1992, Dennis gave an interview as part of a television series profiling criminals. What was revealed was even more chilling than anything disclosed during the trial. The minimum term of his sentence was later replaced in December 1994, ensuring that Denis would never be released from prison, a punishment he accepted. In the years that followed, Denis wrote a 400-page unpublished autobiography. By the 2000s, he spent much of his time translating books into Braille in the prison workshop. He also spent his free time reading, writing, and was allowed to paint and compose music on a keyboard. He exchanged letters with numerous people who wrote to him regularly. In May 2018, after suffering from severe abdominal pain, Denis was transferred to York Hospital. Although an abdominal aortic aneurysm rupture was discovered, and he underwent emergency surgery, he later suffered a pulmonary embolism upon returning to the prison. Enduring excruciating pain and internal bleeding, he spent his final hours in his cell until he died on May 12, 2018. Denis was 72 years old and had served 34 years of his sentence. At least 4 of his victims remain unidentified. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.